So, page 112. Instead of pausing periodically to comment on it, I just want to get it all out of the way so I can, in this last part of this lecture series, just really try as best I can to unfold what on earth is going on here. Okay. Top of 112, quote, "The structure of violence is complex, and its possibility writing is no less so. There was, in fact, a first violence to be named." And Derrida means a first violence to be named in this episode of the little girls, the battle of the proper names, right? There was, in fact, a first violence to be named, and a first violence that Levi-Strauss completely misses. To name, to give names that will on occasion be forbidden to pronounce. Sorry, just a second. To name, to give names that it will on occasion be forbidden to pronounce. Such is the originary violence of language, which consists in inscribing within a difference, in classifying. To think the unique within the system, to inscribe it there, such is the gesture of the arca writing. Arca violence, loss of the proper, of absolute proximity, of self-presence. In truth, this is the crucial part. In truth, the loss of what has never taken place, of a self-presence which has never been given, but only dreamed of. And all was already split, repeated, incapable of appearing to itself, except in its own disappearance. Out of this arc of violence, Derrida goes on to say, forbidden and therefore confirmed by a second violence, that is, reparatory, repertory, protective, instituting the moral, prescribing the concealment of writing and the effacement and obliteration of the so-called proper name, which was already dividing the proper. A third violence can possibly emerge, or not, an empirical possibility, within what is commonly called evil, war, indiscretion, rape, which consists of revealing by effraction the so-called proper name, the originary violence, which has severed the proper from its property and its self-sameness. Skip to the next paragraph. This last violence is all the more complex in its structure because it refers at the same time to the two inferior levels of arca violence and of law. That's the first violence and the second violence. Arca violence and the law, or morality, or normality, or what have you. In effect, this third violence reveals the first nomination, the first naming, which was already an expropriation, right? The impropriety of the proper naming. But it denudes also that which since then functioned as the proper, the so-called proper, substitute of the deferred proper, perceived by the social and moral consciousness as proper, as the proper, and reassuring the seal of secret identity, the secret. Right. So denuding, making insecure that which, after the first nomination, came to operate as the proper name, the substitute of, right, the proper, as it were, that which was perceived by the social and moral consciousness as the proper. Okay. That will complicate that, of course. And in some sense I already have, right? The proper is improper. Anyway. How on earth can we make sense of this, right? This is a very difficult passage. It feels like I'm saying that every time I do a video and in every class, right? But this one in particular is befuddling and difficult. The first violence to be named here is precisely that which I've been talking about this whole time. The gesture or operation of difference in the act of naming, of giving something a proper name. At this originary level, a name marks and inscribes the uniqueness of an entity, and yet in imposing this mark, by giving it a proper name, obliterates its uniqueness, because it is no longer unique unto itself. It operates and circulates within a whole system of classifications, right, in which every entity has its own name, and a name that might actually resemble or be completely identical with the name that's given to that thing or that entity. It becomes classified, and its uniqueness, which was never fully present to itself anyway, is deferred. Originary violence, imposition of, and obliteration of the proper within the structure of a sign. Second stage, the forgetting of that obliteration, the forgetting of this originary violence through the naturalization of the imposition itself, the establishment of the way things are and should be. In other words, right, this is my name. This is who I am. My name is a marker of my things. I put it on my bagged lunch. I put it on my things in my refrigerator if I'm living with other people. I put it on my toys if I'm a kid, right? But it is also the marker of my intentions, my thoughts. It guarantees in other words, the authenticity of those thoughts through the repetition of my signature. These norms and the morality that rears up when they are broken, right? Whenever there's an effraction or an infraction of them, right? These norms forget that the proper name from the get-go is improper. And in the case of the Nambukwara, this forgetting is literally dramatized in the moral or the interdict that forbids the uttering of the proper name, presumably as a way to secure or protect its authenticity. The third mode of violence, if the first is archaviolence and the second is the law, or the forgetting of the obliteration and the normalization of the name itself, the third mode of violence is transgression, the level where empirical violence in the form of assault, war, robbery, or speaking one's own name operates. This is the level at which Levi-Strauss connects writing and violence together in the phrase, the exploitation of man by man, and in the history of the exploitation of man by man, particularly in the writing lesson, which Derrida takes up later in the chapter. But of course, Derrida wants to connect writing and violence in a much more radical level, at that first level of difference, archa-writing, archa-violence, archa-trace. But this third violence is also the level at which the young girls speak each other's proper name, revealing, of course, not so much their true identities. After all, they exist and circulate through this culture just fine without uttering their names, but revealing instead that their proper names are not proper at all, but are mere accessories. Their transgression, Derrida claims, does not just break a code, right, which is the second level of violence. It denudes the fact, it reveals, unveils, denudes the fact that the proper name, as the reassuring seal of self-identity, hidden in secret in this particular culture, was already from the start nothing but a classification, a limitation, and a determination of that which was never fully present to itself within a given framework of appellations, rules, laws, norms, or customs. In short, for Derrida, what he's really beginning to unfold in these sentences is that there are modes of transgression that don't simply break laws or don't simply break norms, but that help one remember, in a way, that which the second level of violence, law, morality, has sought to forget. That there is an obliteration of the proper, the very origin of the proper. That at the origin of an identity, a name, a meaning, a word, a culture, a people, a species, whatever, right? Whatever unit of presence one is speaking about, that at that very point of origin, there is a non-self-sameness. There is difference from the start. In what way is this a useful way? It's a little awkward, whatever. To think about violence, or even about writing. Why is this useful, right? If violence is always already there, if it is already there in ways we might not be able to see, if it can apply even to the act of naming an infant, what good is it, right? If it is everywhere, isn't that the same thing as relativizing it, even saying that it's nowhere? Isn't that the same thing as making it indeterminable and making it impossible to think about the difference between a good or a bad act of violence? Perhaps, right? But perhaps not. What does this approach to violence and writing enable? First, I want to claim it enables a transgressive mode of reading, profoundly at odds with other approaches to literary texts or other sort of cultural texts, other modes of reading that locate the source of the meaning, logic, or production of that text in, for instance, the details of an author's life. That would be biographical reading, right? The specificity of the text style or form, as in formalist readings. The psyche or the psychological features of the author's sub or unconscious, as in psychoanalytic reading, right? The socio-historico-material conditions of the author and his or her class, as in Marxian readings, right? I could go on here, right? Derrida offers a mode of reading that's at odds with these, in a sense, again, because whenever one says that Derrida is at odds with something, it's a bit more complicated than he just outright, denies them or refuses them. For Derrida, one can still learn a great deal from such readings and from such scholarship, right? He doesn't say they're, in some sense, the consequence is not that they're useless or anything, but that but the acknowledgement that they are also nothing but, because readings are nothing but, the constitution and erasure or obliteration of the proper text itself. Think back to the Spivak passage I read in the last lecture series. So this would be Roman numeral 12, I believe. So XII. Spivak writes, the two readings of the quote-unquote same book show an identity that can only be defined as a difference. The book is not repeatable in its identity. Each reading of the book produces a simulacrum of an original, which is never there, right? That is itself the mark of the shifting and unstable subject, the author, which uses and is being used by a language that is also shifting and unstable. Any preface, right, Spivak is talking about her own preface here, any preface commemorates that difference in identity by inserting itself between two readings. In our case, my reading, given of course that my language and I are shifting and unstable, my rereading, my rearranging and translating of the text, and your reading, right? Where do we locate the source of the grammatology? It can't be in the translation, right? Because a translation is a derivative of an original, right? But her point here is that even if we had de la grammatologie, right, itself, that it too is nothing but a source or a product of, right, shifting an unstable language within an author and amongst and between all the possible readings of that text. And so that any preface, any established or standard reading is not standard. It's not proper. A proper reading, just like a proper name, is from the get-go improper. Okay. The identity of a book, if the identity of a book can only be located in its traces, in and between its possible readings, in the differences between my encounter with it and yours, then that means that reading itself, a transgressive reading, might constitute a mode of play among these traces, precisely the sort of reading we see Derrida enacting here. a mode of play among differences, of working with a text that is always already at odds with itself. Thus he turns Lévi-Strauss against himself, turns Saussure against himself. A reading that restores to a text the obliteration of self-sameness or presence at its very origin. Okay. This way of thinking about writing and violence also brings to mind a transgressive mode of writing, of a postmodern mode of writing that works within conventions as a means to subvert and agitate them, that establishes its own form only to subvert itself, that problematizes our distinctions between art and life, text and image, originality and derivativeness, etc. A mode of writing that does not just thematize these problems, but that performs them, that forces us to struggle with them if we are to learn to read them. A text that explicitly, unlike Lévi-Strauss, draws attention to the way in which it's deconstructing itself. And I don't think it would be hard for us to come up with examples of this. B.S. Johnson's Christy Mallory's Own Double Entry, Carol Mazo's The Art Lover, David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas, right? Even Paula Fox's Desperate Characters, which seemed not all that postmodern to some of us, right? We can see ways in which it, too, is performing, right, the fact of its own originary violence, right? The obliteration at its own origin of a self-sameness. Okay, and I'd be happy to talk about that a little bit more in class for people who are maybe uncertain about what it is I'm saying. But so far, what does this way of thinking about writing and violence enable? A transgressive mode of reading, what we might call deconstruction, and a transgressive mode of writing, what we might call postmodernist art or postmodernist literature. Okay. Lastly, and I'm going to end here because I'm going a little long, although this is I'm looking at the timer, far from my longest video. It also enables a transgressive mode of analyzing moral or political or social arguments predicated upon values of nature, purity, or innocence. Not simply in order to prove these positions false, but as a means to make hidden violences or hidden complicities more visible and sensible to us, to ourselves, and to others. This, after all, is what Derrida does with Lévi-Strauss, an otherwise very progressive thinker, who was keen on reversing the racist, nationalist, and imperialist attitudes of the West, of Western explorers, of Western thinkers and statesmen, toward non-Western peoples, right? Attitudes that framed them as barbaric or uncivilized or incapable of art, or thinking, or that sort of stuff. Derrida shows that Lévi-Strauss's anti-ethnocentric interventions, despite those intentions, were complicit in the most resilient ethnocentrism, which of course is logocentrism, the myth of a people without writing, of a people fully intimate, natural, and present and pure unto themselves in speech. And of course, Derrida, in the remainder of the chapter, sort of unfolds that critique. Okay. In short, to begin with the notion of arca-writing, of arca-violence, of arca-trace, of différance, is to admit that I too may be complicit in all sorts of violences that I will only later become aware of, if at all. Though, and this may be Derrida's point, with this as my starting point, I may, unlike Lévi-Strauss, unlike Saussure, actually learn to see those complicities and remedy them, if necessary, and if I am able, by transgressing my own sense, or my culture's sense, of the way things ought to be. Okay. So we might say that, sort of riffing off of China Miéville, right, that deconstruction, or Derrida's philosophy, It's a kind of pedagogy of seeing, right? Not learning to unsee, as in the city and the city, but learning to see. Really, to walk in the breach. Okay. All right. So, hope that was useful. And if you have any questions about this, I would love to talk with you via email or in class on Wednesday. Okay. Do take care. See you soon.